A velvet reckoning is coming, smooth and silent, delivering justice with a touch that you will never see coming. Witness the calculated strategies of those who wait for the perfect moment to reclaim their honor. Hit subscribe now and watch as the final pieces of the puzzle fall.
Morning, my son knocked twice on the kitchen door frame. I almost didn't catch it. I was standing at the counter pouring coffee, half listening to his girlfriend describe her promotion at work, something about a new client portfolio and expanded responsibilities, when I heard it. 2 knocks, soft and unhurried, his knuckle against the painted wood. I looked up. He was smiling at her, nodding, his hands wrapped around his mug. To anyone watching, nothing had happened, but I taught him that knock when he was 11 years old, and I hadn't forgotten it, even after all the years in between. Let me go back. My name is Roy Alderman. I'm 58 years old. I spent 29 years as a licensed home inspector and later a certified fraud investigator for a regional insurance company in western Pennsylvania. The fraud investigation part came later in my career, almost by accident. I'd been so good at noticing things that weren't right in houses. The fresh paint covering water damage, the new subfloor hiding rot underneath, that my supervisor at the time suggested I bring those same instincts to claims work. I did. It turned out the skills transferred almost perfectly. I retired 14 months ago with a settlement payout from a knee surgery that went longer than expected and a pension that covers the basics. My wife, Lorraine, passed 3 years ago. Breast cancer. She was 54. We had 27 years together. And I will tell you honestly that the first winter after she was gone was the hardest thing I have ever lived through. And I say that as a man who has sat across tables from people who looked me in the eye and lied to me with a fluency that used to keep me awake at night. My son Will is 32. He works in IT infrastructure, the kind of work I only partially understand, but that he is clearly good at. He has Lorraine's patience, which was the rarest thing about her, and my stubbornness, which he has never thanked me for. He lived with me for 2 years after her death, not because he had to, but because he said he didn't want me rattling around the house alone. We never talked about it directly. He just showed up one weekend with 2 bags and a box of his things and put them in his old room, and we both pretended it was temporary until it wasn't anymore. He moved out 18 months ago into an apartment 20 minutes away. I was glad for him and also did not sleep well for the first week, which I didn't tell him. He called me in late February to say he'd been seeing someone. A woman named Claudette. They'd met through mutual friends. She was 36, he said, worked in financial consulting, had her own client base. He sounded the way he used to sound when he was a kid and had good news. He was trying to hold on to carefully, like he didn't want to squeeze it too hard. Do you like her? I asked. He laughed a little. Yeah, I do. He asked if I'd be willing to have them both over for dinner the following month, a Sunday. His idea, not hers, he clarified, which I noted. I said, of course. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while. Will had dated before a few times since Lorraine passed, but nothing that had lasted more than a few months. Nothing he'd called to tell me about specifically. This felt different. I didn't know yet whether different meant good. I did what I always do when I have a name in a few minutes. I looked her up. What I found was not alarming. A LinkedIn profile that was professional and filled out correctly. A consulting firm listed in Pittsburgh with a real address and a real web presence. Endorsements from what looked like genuine connections. A graduation photo from Penn State on a professional bio page. I searched her name alongside the words complaint and lawsuit and came up with nothing. Which, in my experience, means one of 2 things. Either the person is exactly what they appear to be, or they are careful. I did not share any of this with Will. I had no reason to. I'd made myself a promise 2 years earlier, after I'd said something skeptical about a woman he'd briefly dated, and he'd gone quiet on me for almost a month. I was going to lead with trust. I was going to act like the father I wanted to be, not the investigator I used to be. I bought a new tablecloth for the dinner. Lorraine always said the table mattered more than people admitted. Claudette arrived with Will on a Sunday afternoon in late March. She brought a small potted herb arrangement, basil and rosemary, the kind of gift that says I looked up what to bring but didn't want to seem like I looked it up. She was tall, well-dressed in a way that was careful without being formal, and she had a smile that arrived a half second before it needed to, which is a very small thing. The kind of thing most people would never notice. I noticed it. She complimented the house warmly and specifically. She asked about the framed photo of the rain on the bookshelf, and when I told her, she said, "I'm sorry. Will talks about her a lot." You can tell she was someone people held on to. It was the right thing to say. I could feel Will relax beside her when she said it. We sat down to eat. I'd made Lorraine's pot roast, the one she made every winter Sunday, the one I've been making since she's been gone, adjusting it slightly each time, getting it a little closer to right. Will poured the wine. Claudette asked good questions and listened to the answers. She and Will had an easy shorthand with each other, the kind that takes real time to build. She talked about her work in a way that was articulate, but not showy. She clearly knew that I'd had a professional background that touched finance and insurance, and she adjusted her explanations accordingly without making it obvious she was doing so. She was good. I want to be clear about that. She was very, very good. We were somewhere in the middle of dinner, the salad finished, the pot roast half gone, when the conversation moved to Will's apartment, a leak he'd been dealing with. The building management's slow response. Claudette put her hand briefly on his arm, sympathetic, and said something about knowing a contractor who did good work. And that's when I heard it. 2 knocks. Will's knuckle on the underside of the table. Soft, deliberate. I kept my face completely still. I reached for my water glass and took a slow sip. Here is what you need to understand about a signal like that. It only works if both of you remember it. I hadn't thought about ours in years. I'd honestly been uncertain whether Will still carried it. We'd made it up when he was in 5th grade after a situation on the school bus that he hadn't been able to explain to adults in the moment. A kid twice his size, a pattern that had been going on for weeks before I knew about it. I told him, if you're somewhere and something feels wrong but you can't say it out loud, 2 knocks on whatever's nearby, I'll know. I'll handle it. He'd remembered. I looked at him. He was listening to Claudette describe the contractor, nodding, his expression open and relaxed. But his left hand was flat on his thigh, fingers slightly curled. I know that posture. I've seen it at kitchen tables and across interview desks and on the witness stand. It's the posture of someone holding something in. I set my glass down. "Claudette," I said, "I'd love to hear more about the consulting work. Will mentioned you focus on individual clients rather than corporate accounts?" She smiled. "Mostly, yeah. I find the corporate side too removed from actual outcomes. I like working with people who have real stakes in the decisions. It keeps everything more honest." "That's a good philosophy," I said. "What does a typical engagement look like?" She walked me through it. She was fluent and natural. She described a process that sounded thorough and personalized, a mix of analysis and planning tailored to the client's situation. She mentioned a few strategies by name. Everything she said was plausible. Everything she said was also the kind of thing that sounds very different depending on what's underneath it. I smiled and stored every word. After dessert, Will went to the kitchen to start the coffee. Claudette and I sat alone for the first time. She said, "He talks about you a lot, the work you did, the cases. He's proud of you." "He's a good kid," I said, "better than I probably gave him room to be." She nodded, warm and attentive. Then, in a voice that was easy and almost offhand, she said, "I hope this isn't too forward, but Will mentioned you have a fairly significant pension and some assets from your settlement that have just been sitting in a standard savings account. I don't want to turn dinner into a work conversation, but if you're ever open to it, I'd love to sit down and show you what some smarter positioning could do for you over the next 10 years. I kept my expression exactly where it was. The same expression I'd used for 29 years in rooms where people assumed I wasn't paying attention. "I'm pretty cautious with that money," I said. "Old habit." "Of course," she said immediately. "No pressure. I just wanted to put it out there." Will came back with the coffee. The conversation moved on. Claudette was gracious and warm through the rest of the evening, helped clear the plates without being asked, said genuine things when she left. Will walked her to her car and came back in while I was washing up. "So," he said. "She seemed sharp," I said. He nodded, pleased, in a careful way that told me he wanted more, but wasn't going to push for it. We talked for a while about other things, and then he drove home. I stood at the kitchen sink for a long time after his taillights disappeared from the driveway. Then I called a woman named Bev Tanner. Bev and I worked together for 11 years at the insurance company. She had moved into independent insurance fraud consulting 4 years before I retired, and she was, without question, the most thorough person I had ever worked alongside. She had a network of contacts across financial services, regulatory agencies, and consumer protection offices that she'd spent 2 decades building, and she used every part of it. She owed me nothing, but we were friends, the kind of friends who don't need to explain context. I called her at 9:15 that evening. She picked up on the third ring. "I need a background on a name," I said. "Financial consultant, Pittsburgh area, claims to run an independent practice." A pause. "How thorough?" "As thorough as it gets." She called me back 3 days later. I was in the backyard replacing a rotted fence post, something I'd been meaning to do since November, when my phone rang. "Roy," she said, "I need to ask you something first. How serious is your son about this woman?" My chest went cold. "Tell me what you found." Her name was not Claudette Marsh, as she'd introduced herself. It was Claudette Morrow. She had legally changed her name 6 years ago in conjunction with a move from the Cincinnati area to Pittsburgh. Bev had found 2 formal consumer complaints filed with the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities, both for men in their late 50s and early 60s, both widowed, both describing a nearly identical pattern, a relationship that developed over several months through a mutual friend or social connection. A gradual introduction of investment opportunities that turned out to involve transfers to accounts that were difficult to trace back to any legitimate underlying asset. One complaint had been investigated but closed due to insufficient evidence. One had resulted in a civil settlement with sealed terms. There was also a third name attached to a Better Business Bureau complaint in Ohio, filed under an entity called Marsh Financial Consulting, which had been dissolved 4 years ago. The complaint described advance fees paid for services that were never delivered, totaling just over $18,000. In each case, the target had been introduced to Claudette through someone who had already been cultivated by her. A friend who'd trusted her. A neighbor who'd vouched for her. Someone who didn't know they were being used as a door. I sat down on the back porch steps with the phone in my hand. "Has she asked him for anything directly?" Bev asked. "Not yet," I said. "But she asked me about my pension and my settlement payout. At dinner. Tonight was the first time she met me." "Roy." Bev's voice was careful. "You understand what that means." I did. The relationship with Will was the introduction. I was the target. The playbook was almost identical to what I'd seen in insurance fraud cases. Establish credibility through an emotional connection, then leverage that connection toward a financial ask that feels natural, because it's wrapped in warmth. I thought about the half-second early smile, the right gift, the comment about Lorraine that landed so precisely. She hadn't been warm. She'd been working. "I need to tell Will," I said. "You need to be careful about how," Bev said. "If he's emotionally invested and you walk in with accusations before he has something he can see and hold, you'll lose him. These situations don't end well when the family member overplays their hand. The target ends up defending the person they care about, and the family member becomes the obstacle." She was right. I knew she was right because I had watched it happen from the other side of a desk more than once. The fraud works precisely because it borrows trust. The moment you try to take the trust back by force, the whole thing collapses in the wrong direction. "Give me some time," I said. "I want to say something here about why Will might not have seen it himself. Because the question I knew people would ask is the same question I used to ask in case reviews. Why didn't they just say no?" Will had watched his mother die. He'd moved back in with me for 2 years and then moved out and rebuilt something quiet and functional for himself. He was 32 and careful, in the specific way that people are careful, after they've seen the people they love most go through things they can't fix. When someone comes along who makes that careful life feel less necessary, who makes the guarding feel like it might finally be okay to put down, that's not a character flaw, that's being human. What Claudette had built over several months was not just a relationship, it was a specific architecture of trust and relief. Dismantling it wouldn't feel like liberation, it would feel like loss. Will needed to see it for himself, and I needed to give him the conditions to do that. So I set a trap. I called Will 2 days later and told him I'd been thinking about what Claudette said at dinner, about my pension and settlement. I told him I was open to hearing more. I asked if he could arrange a follow-up, the 3 of us, the following Saturday afternoon. He was quiet for a moment. Really? I thought you were pretty set on keeping things where they are. Maybe I've been too rigid about it, I said. I'm 58. I should probably stop pretending I know what I'm doing with retirement accounts. He laughed, and it cost me something to hear it. The following week, I spent preparing. I called a former colleague named Warren Doyle who had moved into private financial regulatory consulting after leaving the state attorney general's office, and asked him to be available Saturday afternoon. I contacted my bank and placed a precautionary hold on any transfers over $500 pending a secondary verification call. I also called Bev back and asked her to prepare a printed summary of everything she'd found, clean and readable, the kind of document that didn't require explanation. I called Will on Thursday. Not about any of this, just to talk, about his week, about a trail he'd been thinking about hiking, about a show he'd started watching. He sounded fine. Easy. I listened to all of it and said the right things, and after I hung up, I sat in the chair by the window where Lorraine used to read and thought about how he'd knocked twice on the table and trusted me to catch it. Saturday came. Claudette arrived with Will, and this time she brought printed materials, a folder of documents, a prospectus for something called Vanguard Adjacent Portfolio Solutions, which was not affiliated in any way with the actual Vanguard funds, despite the name clearly intending to suggest it. She had a tablet for charts and projections. She was organized, polished, confident. I let her go through all of it. I asked questions that were not really questions. I asked about the custodial structure of the underlying funds, who held the assets, and in what capacity. I asked about SEC registration for the investment vehicle she was describing. I asked about her own registration with FinRe, specifically her CRD number. She had answers for everything. Good answers. Prepared answers. The CRD number she gave me sounded plausible, which told me she expected a surface-level check and had prepared for one. I'd actually like to verify some of this before I make any decisions, I said. My former colleague, Bev Tanner, spent about 15 years in financial fraud investigation. She's thorough. Do you mind if I loop her in this week? The temperature in the room changed. It was subtle. Claudette didn't move or reach for anything. But something behind her eyes recalibrated. The way things recalibrated when a plan encounters a variable it didn't account for. Of course, she said evenly, transparency is always welcome. Wonderful, I said. She actually worked on a case out of Cincinnati a few years back, around the time you were there, probably before you moved up here and went independent. What year was that exactly? 2018. She looked at me. I looked back. Will was very still. The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then Claudette began to gather her documents. She was unhurried, controlled. She said something about wanting to get me proper registration documentation before we went further, that she wanted everything to be above board. She thanked me for the afternoon. She squeezed Will's hand when she stood. I walked her to the door. Warren Doyle was standing on the front porch. He introduced himself briefly and clearly. He told her that he had been retained to deliver documentation and that she would likely be receiving a formal inquiry from the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities within the next 2 weeks, as a new review had been opened following supplemental materials submitted that week. He told her it would be in her interest to remain reachable. She stood there for a moment. Then she walked to her car and drove away. Steady speed. No hesitation. She was a professional right up to the end. I closed the front door. Will was standing in the middle of the living room. He had her prospectus in one hand and he was holding it the way you hold something you don't quite know what to do with yet. "Dad," he said, "how long have you known?" "I suspected at dinner," I said. "I had enough to be certain by Wednesday." He set the folder down on the coffee table. He sat on the couch and put both hands over his face and stayed like that for a moment. I sat in the chair across from him and didn't say anything. "I knew something was off," he said finally. "I didn't know what. There was just something." I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. "You weren't paranoid," I said. "You knocked." He looked up. "I heard it," I said. He sat with that. Then he said, "What did she actually do to other people?" I told him. Not all of it at once, but enough. The name change, the complaints, the sealed settlements, the Ohio case. He listened the way Lorraine used to listen, without interrupting, without getting ahead of the information. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. "There were other men like me," he said. It wasn't really a question. Yes. Who else was she using to get to them? People they trusted, I said. People who didn't know they were being used. He thought about that. I watched him work through it. The months, the dinners, the conversations, everything he believed was real. Running it back through a different lens now. It's a disorienting thing, that kind of re-seeing. I'd watched people do it in formal interviews and I knew better than to rush it. After a while, he said, I want to give a statement. If they open a full case, I want to be on record. I was with her long enough that I probably know things that are useful. I wasn't surprised, but I was proud. The specific kind of pride that has nothing to do with you, that belongs entirely to someone else. We spent the rest of the afternoon at the kitchen table. He pulled up his email and his texts, and we went through them together methodically, flagging anything that might have weight. At one point he stopped and looked up at me. When did you teach me that? He said. The knock? Yeah. 5th grade, I said. The bus thing. He nodded slowly. I forgot it was that specific. He paused. I forgot why you came up with it. Your mother suggested it, I said. After the bus thing, she said kids need a way to say something's wrong without having to say it in front of the thing that's wrong. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't remember that it was her idea, he said. Most of the good ones were, I said. The Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities formally issued a notice of investigation into Claudette Morrow within 3 weeks. Warren connected Bev's documentation to the investigators, and one of the original complainants, a retired electrical contractor from Pittsburgh's South Side, agreed to participate in the renewed inquiry. The other complainant's family was contacted and confirmed willingness to cooperate. I don't know the full outcome as I write this. These things take time, and the law moves at its own pace. But they move. Will took a week off in May. He came over most evenings. We watched baseball, worked on a drainage problem in the backyard that had been bothering me since spring, drove out to a state park one afternoon where Lorraine and I used to go in the fall. We didn't talk about Claudette much. There wasn't much left to say that hadn't been said. On his last evening before he went back to work, he helped me finally get the new tablecloth on straight, the one I'd bought for the dinner and had been struggling with ever since. The wrong size for the table, stubbornly crooked no matter how I adjusted it. We ended up laughing about it, genuinely laughing, the kind of laughing that happens when something small becomes suddenly absurd. We stood back and looked at the table. Can I ask you something? He said. Always. When you were doing the fraud work, the cases where you had a strong feeling about someone, but you weren't sure yet, did you ever worry you were wrong? I thought about it honestly. Every time, I said. That's the point of building the case. The feeling tells you where to look. The work tells you what's actually there. He nodded slowly. The knock was the feeling, I said. Everything after it was the work. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to teach it to my kids someday, if I have them. He looked a little sideways at me when he said it, like he expected me to make something of it. I didn't. It's a good thing to pass on, I said. He left around 9. I stood on the porch and listened to his car until the sound faded out at the end of the street. Inside, I turned off the lights the way I do every night, room by room. In the hallway, I stopped at the bookshelf and looked at Lorraine's photo for a moment. Then I knocked twice on the shelf, gently with 2 fingers. I went to bed. I think about the knock a lot now. 2 quiet taps on the underside of a dinner table, made by a 32-year-old man who still remembered something his father told him when he was 11. That's not a small thing. That's a person who kept something alive inside himself for 2 decades, because some part of him knew he might need it. What happened with Claudette was not random. It followed a logic, the same logic I'd watched play out in case files for nearly 30 years. People who run this kind of scheme don't succeed by being reckless. They succeed by being patient, by reading what a person needs and giving them a version of it, carefully, over time. They find the gap, the grief, the loneliness, the long stretch of careful living, and they fill it so precisely that the filling feels like it belongs there. Claudette didn't deceive Will because he was foolish. She deceived him because she was skilled at finding people who were good and tired of being guarded, and she was willing to use that goodness against them. The outcome wasn't luck. Will knocked because something in him hadn't stopped paying attention, even when the rest of him wanted to. That kind of integrity. The willingness to trust your own discomfort even when everything visible tells you there's nothing wrong. That's not something you're born with. It's built, slowly, through the small decisions you make about what to do with what you notice. Will made that decision at a dinner table while smiling at a woman he cared about, and it cost him something to do it. That cost is what made it mean something. I did the work after because it was the only responsible thing to do with what he'd handed me. 30 years of learning how fraud thinks, how it hides, how it borrows credibility from the people around it. None of that would have mattered if I'd let pride or fear, or the desire to avoid difficulty, stop me from using it. The intelligence I'd spent a career building was only worth something if I was willing to deploy it when it mattered most, when the stakes were personal enough to make caution feel like the easier path. I wasn't going to let that be the reason I failed him. And then the harder part. Telling him. Sitting with him while he ran it all back through his memory and understood what had been done. That takes a different kind of strength in the investigation. The kind that doesn't have a procedural manual. The kind where you just have to stay in the room and let someone feel what they need to feel without trying to fix it faster than it can be fixed. Lorraine was better at that than I ever was. I tried to remember what she would have done, and I stayed. What I know now, more clearly than I did before, is that the signals we make with the people we love, the small, private languages we build between us, they don't expire. They wait, and the people worth holding on to are the ones who keep them. Even when years go by, even when nothing has called for them, Will kept ours. And when the moment came, he used it without hesitation, without knowing what I'd do with it, trusting that I'd know what to do. That trust is the thing I want to be worthy of for whatever time I have left. I knocked twice on Lorraine's bookshelf that night, after Will drove home and the house went quiet. I don't know if that means anything, but it felt like the right thing to do.